Yeah, this is a nice height, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. So
especially since I'm tall, I can't.
yeah, right. And no, I think I'll go from there. That's good.
Okay, Jurgen says we should start. So let me begin by adding my thanks to Jurgis and Jesse and Eduard and everyone else who put together this fantastic conference. Welcome to the panel on cognitive penetrability and language. Eduard, we're starting. and I'm going to be kicking things off with just some general orienting remarks, and afterwards we'll hear from Casey O'Callaghan and Michael DeViTT. Unfortunately, Barry Smith turned out he wasn't able to join us today, so we'll just have 3 instead of 4. As I say, I'm charged with giving us some general orienting remarks, and so I figured at a conference like this, a lot of papers, you've been hearing about a lot of the same things over and over again, that perhaps I should begin with something just completely different to kind of wake everyone up. So I take it no one's familiar with this topic here, so no, I didn't know we were going to be at the end, so sorry, you're going to hear some things again. So cognitive penetrability, and as other speakers said, please just let me know if I start wandering away from the microphone or anything like that, or start talking too fast, which will happen. So cognitive penetrability concerns whether cognition affects, as Polition puts it, other systems, in particular perception, and he's particularly interested in vision, whereby cognition is meant the organism's goals and beliefs. One could mean something else by cognition, but that's what he means, and he's defined this technical term. And we're not interested in any old way that cognition can affect perception. To have an interesting question, we want to exclude various kinds of indirect effects. After all, it's obvious that your goals and beliefs can cause you to redirect your attention. And so I should say, given Rob's talk yesterday, that I don't mean to be saying that such phenomena are uninteresting, far from it, but it would make the question of whether there's cognitive penetrability uninteresting if we were to include that. So you can think of the question as one of, given the obvious interesting fact that cognition can affect perception via, indirectly, say, via a shift in attention, here's a further interesting question. Are there other ways that cognition can affect perception that wouldn't be indirect? So Polition, in wanting to exclude or bracket these sorts of things, gives us such glosses as this, that we're interested in whether the function the system computes is sensitive in a semantically coherent way to the organism's goals and beliefs. Okay, so we're interested in whether cognition in this sense indirectly affects perception, but what's meant by perception, and here we can distinguish three questions. So one is Polition's question. Polition wants to know whether there is a significant part of the processes implicated in perception, so implicated in vision in the case he's most interested in, that's cognitively impenetrable. But that question can be distinguished from the question of whether perceptual experience, conscious perceptual experience with its phenomenal character, is cognitively impenetrable. And that in turn can be distinguished from the question of whether perceptual judgments are cognitively impenetrable, whereby perceptual judgments or perceptually based judgments is meant roughly judgments that are more or less immediately, causally, and or epistemically based upon perceptual non-judgmental, I should say, non-judgmental perceptual states. And we're presumably, if one's going to ask that kind of question, one's asking whether such judgments are cognitively penetrated by the rest of cognition. Otherwise, they're sort of trivially penetrating themselves. Okay. So correspondingly, in the case of cognitive penetrability with respect to language, one has three questions. One is there a cognitively impenetrable linguistic input analyzer? Second question is perceptual experience of language cognitively penetrable? And a third question is, are metalinguistic judgments cognitively penetrable? Or at least might there be some interesting subclass of metalinguistic judgments we are interested in for some reason or another? Are they cognitively penetrable or not by the rest of one's cognition? I've thrown in the quasis there to bracket an orthogonal question. You might be wondering whether, when we're talking about language comprehension, whether this should be counting as a kind of perception at all, not tied to a particular modality, but it's orthogonal, so I'm not going to worry about it. All right, so for the rest of my remarks, I'm just going to be giving us a highly selective and very sketchy, shallow survey of some of the considerations that have been raised under each of these three headings with respect to each of these three questions. And my goal is not to argue for any particular position, but really just to remind us of some of the standard moves that are made to set up the other talks on the panel. So, okay, is there a cognitively impenetrable linguistic input analyzer? The first question. The first obvious thing to say is that a positive answer doesn't require that all of language comprehension be something that's gotten from the linguistic input analyzer. So a very familiar reason to think that you don't want that would be given by the effects of world knowledge on anaphora resolution. So there's the difference between we gave the bananas to the monkeys because they were hungry versus we gave the bananas to the monkeys because they were ripe. Oh, let me pause for 1 second. I just remembered something I'd meant to say. I said something earlier on the earlier slide about bracketing effects of attention. And I wanted to remind us, as Fiona did yesterday, that there's discussion in the literature about just what is a fruitful way of glossing or posing a cognitive penetrability question. And I'm not going to have too much to say about that, but I will have some stray remarks here and there about the promiscuous notion of attention. So that'll be coming up. Okay, back to where I was. Okay, so if there is an impenetrable linguistic input analyzer, of course it doesn't need to encompass all of language comprehension, so people have given a positive answer about some significant part. So Fodor, though certainly not only Fodor, claims that yes, there is. It's something that yields structural descriptions up to ambiguity, and a significant component of this is one's capacity for phoneme recognition, and I focus our attention in on that just to make things a bit more manageable, and I'll now talk about some of the considerations that have been given in standard moves in reply, because some people have challenged whether phoneme recognition is cognitively penetrable. Just give like an example of one person there. So what are the kinds of considerations that people have raised? Well, for example, on a variety of different kinds of phoneme recognition tasks, the lexical status of some of the things that are involved in the task can have an effect on performance. So for example, whether what one has is an actual word in the language as opposed to something that's a phonologically possible word in the language that doesn't happen to be an actual word in the language. So in English, pat versus quat. So whether stimuli of the one kind or the other is involved in the task can make a big difference on the subject's performance. And so it's been claimed that shows that knowledge of what are the words in your language penetrates the capacity for phoneme recognition. But the standard reply to this sort of consideration is to say that, look, that kind of information, there's independent reason to expect and to believe, is available to the linguistic input analyzer itself. And so the point is then often made in the course of making that kind of reply that one ought not to confuse the top-down availability of information with cognitive penetrability. It depends where the information is coming from, so it needn't be actually coming from what the subject's actual beliefs. It's also worth noting that the fact that there's information that's available intramodularly doesn't entail top-down processing. And so in the psycholinguistics literature, one finds models attempting to accommodate these various kinds of lexical status effects, some of which are involve top-down feedback, and some of which are completely feed-forward. McQueen has a more recent model that's Bayesian that's also completely feed-forward, but makes use of lexical information. Okay, a second sort of consideration that gets raised is that that apparently the surrounding semantics that the target phoneme is embedded in can have an effect on performance in phoneme recognition tasks. So there's the well-known phoneme restoration illusion. You can get people to have the auditory hallucination of hearing a phoneme. So, you know, you can have subjects who are presented with the soldier's thoughts of the dangerous bat made him very nervous, and in the right conditions they restore the missing phoneme. And other subjects might get the pitcher's thoughts of the dangerous bat made him very nervous. And in the one case, if they get the effect at all, what will be facilitated is battle, the soldier's thoughts about the battle, and in the other case, it would be the pitcher's thoughts about the batter. And there it seems that there's an effect on the performance based on the surrounding semantics, or maybe the surrounding, you know, or maybe world knowledge. So there's penetration of phoneme recognition by world knowledge. The standard reply to these sorts of cases is to say that, once again, there's information available intramodularly, and indeed it needn't even be semantic information, that we expect and have independent reason to believe that the linguistic input analyzer is keeping track of a fair amount of statistical regularities and can set up associations among just word occurrence. And so for such effects as has been found, and it's actually not so easy to get the effect actually, it seems it can be explained by lower level wave. I mentioned parenthetically that some people, based on work by Arthur Samuel, some people including Fodor at one point, suggest that it might be that in fact one does have cognitive penetrability in these sorts of cases. Samuel gives a signal detection analysis that gives some reason to think that the lexical status effects is different in kind than the surrounding semantics effects. One seems to have an effect on discriminability, and the other one rather just on biasing or a threshold that has to be crossed. That argument actually has been challenged, for example, by Polishin. But I just want to point out that if we're only talking about question one, it's perfectly fine to react to some of these phenomena by saying, yeah, it just shows that there's maybe less in the linguistic input analyzer than one might have thought. Some of this stuff might be post-perceptual, just a question of what should we be counting as perceptual and what not. I'll be coming back to that when we get to question two. A third kind of consideration that some people have brought forward has to do with speakers' accents. So you can have two people with regional accents that differ, and they produce in principle the exact same acoustic stimulus, but a subject will generate different phonemes in response to one than they will in response to the other. Suppose the one person says pack, and they're talking about their backpack, and the other person's from Boston and says pack, and they're talking about packing the cat. So Applebaum actually goes so far as to say this shows that knowledge of the speaker's identity can cognitively penetrate phoneme recognition. The standard reply to this, however, is that it's a stimulus-driven effect. The linguistic input analyzer is, we have independent reason to believe, is able to adapt to the speaker's idiosyncratic vowel space. And so it's actually not being penetrated by the speakers' beliefs and goals. Finally, another kind of case for which is a different kind of reply. It's often pointed out that a non-linguistic cognitive load can greatly impact subjects' performance on phoneme recognition tasks. So while you have them do the task, you also have them do they have to do some numerical calculation or whatever, whatever it might be. And the reply to this is that, hey, that's just an effect of the allocation of attention. So we should bracket that. It's not this kind of effect that's of interest to the question of cognitive penetrability, though it might be of interest for other reasons. I may point out, however, that this seems to be a different kind of attention than the kind of example I was talking about before, where your goals and beliefs might change your focal attention. Most of Polishyn's discussion of attention has to do with changes in focal attention. For example, what explains the seemingly voluntary flipping of ambiguous figures, the change in focal attention. And so, as I'll be saying one more time later on, this raises the question of just how many different things that fall under the heading of attention do we want to use to bracket phenomena if we want to still have an interesting question about cognitive penetrability. Okay, one last thing under this heading is just worth reminding ourselves that phoneme restoration is an illusion that persists. So you can know all about phoneme restoration, have seen lots of examples of it, know as much as there is to know about how it works, and you'll still can be made to succumb to it. So if there is cognitive penetration, it's cognitive penetration that's limited. At least your belief that your beliefs about that particular situation will not affect whether you have the illusion. Okay. Okay, maybe move on now to the second question. Is perceptual experience of language cognitively penetrable? Well, most, not all, but many phoneme recognition tasks involve subjects reporting experience of what they heard, what they take themselves to have heard. And so a lot of those kinds of considerations we were just looking at can be trotted out here also. But then, of course, also obviously a lot of the same replies can be trotted out. But you might think, but maybe not the move to say that, well, maybe this particular case, maybe we should just grant that this one's post-perceptual. I mean, after all, the subject's reporting what they heard. So it seems that move's not available unless one's willing to say that what's going on is that the speaker is simply wrong about their phenomenology, or maybe not just wrong about whether this is an aspect of their phenomenological character of their state overall, but more specifically, they're confusing some non-perceptual phenomenology with perceptual phenomenology. Okay, but the consideration that mainly comes up under this heading is a different one. That language sounds different, it's often said, to someone who knows a language than it does to someone who doesn't know that language, perhaps that same person earlier before they learned the language. And Casey, in a recent paper on the topic, has a long, seemingly endless list of quotes of philosophers making this claim in order to argue for the cognitive penetrability of the experience of language. Similarly, letters in an orthography you learn can then look different afterwards. But it can't be that simply pointing to that phenomenon is clearly not sufficient to establish cognitive penetrability. It's obvious that the linguistic input analyzer itself changes in the course of learning a language, and that's obviously something that's stimulus-driven. It might be that you've put yourself in the way of of all these stimuli because of your goals and beliefs. You might want to be able to converse with your in-laws in French, and so you take a French class and direct your attention on this stimuli. And that's an interesting phenomenon, but that would be the kind of indirect effect that we're not concerned with. So, but the more specific argument these philosophers make is that the phenomenology differs in a very particular way. That after you learn the language, part of the phenomenology is that you actually experience the meanings. You hear the words as meaning such and such. And so the claim is that to explain this particular aspect of the phenomenological difference, you have to commit yourself to some sort of cognitive penetrability. An alternative argument, a different argument for this conclusion, is that in order for linguistic experience to play the proper kind of epistemic role, one needs to say there's experience of meanings, and thus there's cognitive penetrability. I'm not going to say anything further, though, about these kinds of arguments, because that'll be the subject or part of the subject of Casey's talk, and it's also the subject of Barry's talk, too, but he's but you'll have to imagine that one. Okay, let me pass on to one other kind of consideration that gets raised. So sometimes people point to local contextual expectations and how they can affect the experience of language. And here, by the word expectation, I mean actual beliefs about how things are going to be, not information that would be stored down at some lower level. And I'll use a case I take from Alva, though I hasten to mention Alva wasn't explicitly talking about cognitive penetrability, at least not by that label, when he brings up this case. So the case is one where Alva and his young son are in Germany. The young son, not knowing any better, they're in the S-Bahn, they go up to some guy sitting across the way with a dog, and the son says in English, is he friendly? And the guy just kind of looks at him, and he says, is he friendly? The guy just shakes his head, trying to figure out what's going on, and then Alva says, Entschuldigung, ist er freundlich? And the guy sort of pops to and says in fluent English, oh yes, he's very friendly. Sorry, because you just didn't even realize that the person was speaking English. And that's anecdotally, that's something that's happened to many of us, I'm sure. So Alva says, look, you can't hear it as English unless you have this expectation. You have the wrong expectation. You have this other expectation. There's a lot of work on bilinguals and how they manage their multiple languages, and for example, in code switching in the course of a conversation, and all of the models that I know of standardly advert to attentional inhibition to explain what's going on. So it seems once again we have an indirect effect, though we should mark the fact that here too it's not the same kind of attentional modulation that Polition focused on. And so given the many different things that fall under the label of attention, my colleague Steve Yantis, who works on, he's a eminent world leader on attention. When you ask him what attention is, it seems that just about any kind of modulation or inhibition or facilitation that affects information flow counts as an attentional effect. But if that's so, if we're going to use the term in such a broad way, then we might trivialize the question of cognitive penetrability in the other direction. Any old effect is going to turn out to be an attentional effect. So it seems it's an interesting question that perhaps has been underexplored in the literature. If we want to have an interesting, fruitful question of cognitive penetrability, maybe we need to be clear about just what kinds of attentions are the ones we want to bracket and which ones not. Of course, people who work on attention who aren't thinking in particular about cognitive penetrability are already worrying about, is it a unified thing or many different things or what. Okay, but having marked that, I'm now going to pass on to the third of the questions. So the third question is this: are metalinguistic perceptual judgments cognitively penetrable? Let me distinguish here two kinds of candidate metalinguistic perceptual judgments. So on the one hand, we have judgments about what was said. I guess those are the metalinguistic judgments that we tend to care about the most when we're actually engaged in language use. But they're not the only metalinguistic judgments, or metalinguistic perceptual judgments that we're capable of. And there's another class of judgments that are of great interest to linguists. For example, judgments of acceptability and the other kinds of metalinguistic judgments, so-called linguistic intuitions, that form a crucial, indeed the central part, though it's not exhaustive, of the evidential base of linguistics. About the first class of cases, you might say, well, they're just sort of obviously cognitively penetrable. We already mentioned anaphora resolution, for example. But maybe it's not so obvious what we should say about the second class of metalinguistic perceptual judgments. Given their role in linguistics, there's possibly a threat if they are cognitively penetrable. Well, I should say, when I say given their role in linguistics, among other things, I have in mind the fact that often, to be sure, not always, but often the linguistic intuitions that linguists make use of are their own intuitions. So insofar as the evidential base includes lots and lots of the linguist's own metalinguistic perceptual judgments, then if they're cognitively penetrable, there's such worries as, that there's the threat of unrepresentativeness, that most of the intuitions the science is based on are expert intuitions, not lay intuitions, and also the obvious threat of confirmation bias. This is now making remarks in part to set up and introduce Michael's talk. Michael's view is that linguistic intuitions are, like all judgments, are theory-laden, but that the linguists make use of their own judgments is not epistemically pernicious. They should use other evidence too. They shouldn't just use only that kind of evidence. But it's not epistemically pernicious because it's better to be laden with better theory. And so at least when it comes to hard cases and things like that, it's a better thing for them to rely on their own intuitions. Now, as a matter of fact, so there's a question, are they in fact theory-laden? Are they in fact cognitively penetrable? Or are they affected by the other sorts of judgments one has or not? So as a matter of fact, linguists who have been worried about these sorts of methodological worries and other worries as well, have spent a lot of time in the past 15 years or so engaged in what falls under the heading experimental syntax. There's similar work in experimental phonology, experimental semantics, where the idea is to gather these sorts of intuitions, acceptability judgments, etc., in a more formal way. So with a larger number of subjects, with more representative samples under controlled conditions, with greater care about the rating scale and statistical analysis performed, et cetera, et cetera. And arguably, the main result of a largish body of work has been the general vindication of informally gathered linguistic intuitions. Because the gathering of these intuitions formally, including gathering linguist intuitions formally, allows the comparison of the subject's performance on these tasks, and also allows the comparison with the informally gathered intuitions. And so there's been a lot of work, for example, going back and looking at the intuitions in 10 years worth of the journal Linguistic Inquiry that linguists have made use of, and looking at the intuitions that are reported in all the major textbooks and stuff. And there's just the lay expert divergence has simply not been found. Okay, there's a few studies that, but they're methodologically unsound. But the main result has been that you just don't find this sort of divergence. One result, actually, has been construed as a test of confirmation bias, though, I kind of hesitate to mention it because this is one of the ones that actually did find a expert versus lay difference, but there's reasons to worry about it. But in any case, hey, but I'm cherry picking, what can I say? But I'm gonna then disagree a little bit with this result too. But, so anyway, but there's a result that's been construed as a test of confirmation bias that actually found the reverse effect. So they were comparing the judgments of syntacticians in the generative tradition with cognitive functional syntacticians, and the generativists judged less harshly than the functionalists various kinds of complex NP island constructions. Where you might have thought you were going to find the reverse. It's actually unclear to me that you actually get the result that others have read into the Dubrovska work, because it's unclear that you should expect that the generativists and the functionalists will disagree in their judgments of acceptability of these sentences. What they disagree in is their explanation of why they're unacceptable. At least that's what I'd want to say, though not everyone agrees with that. But still, you might wonder, why would there be even a reverse effect at all, assuming that the result is a robust one? And actually, one of the hypotheses that's been put forward is that this might be an effect of normalization through exposure. So the idea is that because these island constructions are very, very important in various areas of syntax in the generative tradition, people spend a lot of time thinking about these cases and exposing themselves to these sentences and going, and mumbling them to themselves, what do I think about them? Unlike the cognitive functionalist syntacticians who think that it's just memory load and so they're not interested in this. And so the claim is that it actually might have had a specific local effect on their I language, on their linguistic input analyzer, and that's why they judge them differently. But then it's stimulus driven, not cognitive penetrability. Okay. Okay, I already said that part. So I don't want to say that there's been no cognitive penetrability found, and I don't just mean that there are some studies where there's maybe methodological questions. The most, a very well-known case, somewhat amusing case, is Bill Above investigating a Philadelphia dialect in the American city of Philadelphia that has positive anymore. So in most English dialects, the word anymore is a negative polarity licensing item. So it has to be in some sense in a negative context. So you can say, I don't have friends anymore, but not I have friends anymore. But in this Philadelphia dialect, there's actually a positive anymore that semantically is kind of like nowadays. They have a lot of hot dogs there anymore. They have a lot of hot dogs there nowadays, or something like that. But the interesting part is that there's these interviews with subjects where they say, I've never heard that construction. Have I used that? I've never used that. I've never even heard it. What are you talking about? And in the course of the interview, they use it. And he has other results with example from Swedish phonology and some other things. And they all seem to be cases where there's a perceived social stigma attached to this linguistic phenomenon. But I note that Lebov's paper is not titled it's not titled Intuitions Fail. The title of his paper is When Intuitions Fail. He's very clear that he thinks that linguistic intuitions are quite reliable. But there are these special cases, and there's reasons to predict why they might occur. And then the question is, can we arm ourselves against them in advance, and what should we do when we do have this sort of failure? And so you might then conclude from that, well, this class of judgments are cognitively penetrable, but it turns out they're not actually penetrated very often, at least in the conditions under which linguists elicit them. There's not much reason to be worried about. Okay, so those are the three different areas in which you could see questions of cognitive penetrability of language coming up, and I will now say thanks and hand things over to our other two speakers. Oh, and we're going to, yeah, thank you. We're going to take, we're going to have our discussion all at the end and stuff like that, because that way I won't get any questions. But yeah, anyway. So, okay, Casey. Yeah, I guess you can talk amongst yourselves for a second while we change. You want to move up here? Do we need to just use mine? Do you want the handheld?
Yes.
Okay. Where is the handheld? Okay. I'm going to turn this one off.
Hello? Is that on? Try to do this one a little more informally than the last. So I might stumble a little more. So I want to talk a little bit about this claim that Stephen mentioned, which is that humans, competent humans, sometimes can perceptually experience meanings or semantic properties. Okay, so the claim that I'm targeting is sometimes it's possible to perceptually represent or to be perceptually aware as of meanings or semantic properties. This is actually, I think, part of a more interesting set of questions to do with perceptual experience of language that have been relatively unaddressed or underaddressed by philosophers. So philosophers, especially philosophers of language and mind, have paid a lot of attention to the requirements on understanding language. And those discussions have focused on things like grasping concepts or knowing a grammar. And they've paid less attention to the perceptual requirements on understanding language. And there's a sort of long line of really simplistic approaches to the perception, which is just that there's a sound, and then all the interesting stuff happens at the level of cognition, and then you have understanding. But it's, of course, much more complicated than that. And there's also, for those of you who are interested in empirically informed philosophy, there's just a huge and, in fact, really intimidating body of experimental and theoretical work to sink your teeth into and try to master. So that's one reason to be interested in this. The other reason is a little more focused, and that's because it impacts this recent set of debates about the kinds of properties that can be perceptually experienced. So a sort of conservative approach to perceptual experience says that, look, it's only these kind of low-level features, colors and sounds and smells that you can perceptually experience. And then the more liberal approach says, no, it's all sorts of high-level stuff. Maybe things like natural kind properties, and the case of semantic properties or meanings often gets invoked in those discussions and treated as of a kind with those. And then, of course, it's possible to have a sort of moderately liberal approach, which is sort of either mid-level properties or what the kinds of things you're aware of, or maybe it's a kind of mix of high and low level. What I'm going to talk about today, I think, suggests that maybe the case of semantic properties or meanings shouldn't be clumped in so quickly with the case of higher level properties like natural kind properties, that we should maybe treat it as a special kind of case for reasons I'll get into. Okay, so that's why you should care. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the arguments in favor of this, and then I'm going to talk about some of the commitments of the account. Actually, can somebody tell me when I started so that I know when I have to stop? So I have 30 minutes from now, right? No. I'm going to talk about some of the arguments in favor of the account, and then I'm going to talk about some of the commitments. And so the argument generally runs, or the kinds of arguments I'm interested in here, run from these phenomenal contrast cases. Now, phenomenal contrast cases usually go like this. There's a nice contrast. We can detect it, in the best cases, from the first person, and in a relatively limited time frame. So then we can run the argument from the first person perspective. And I mean, you can sort of think of Descartes' argument like this. He said there isn't any phenomenal contrast that we notice from the first person perspective. So that's part of what makes it so forceful, is it depends on that first person case. In any case, then what you do is you argue abductively that there's the best explanation for that is the representation or awareness as of some particular kind of feature. So in the case of language, it goes like this. There's a big difference between what it's like to hear a language or to experience some language when you know that language. Okay, so a lot of people have said this. So that was the why care. Here's just a basic kind of statement of the view that listening to someone speaking clearly on a subject you know in a language you understand is a quite different kind of experience. And lots of people accept this sort of thing. As Steve mentioned, if you really want to find the full catalog, you can go to this, anyways, recent paper of mine. So like, this is a sort of claim, even Jesse accepts this claim. It's that uncontroversial. So this remark says, you know, if a monolingual English speaker hears the word Hund, I don't know how to say that properly, but it's just a sound. If a German speaker hears it, the experience is phenomenally different. And then Jesse agrees with Galen Strawson about this point. And then there's lots of other people who say this sort of thing. Now, the first thing you notice is that, well, look, there's a lot of, you know, there may be cognitive differences here. For the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to suppose it's plausible that the difference is perceptual. I have some arguments for that, but I'm not going to get into them. So the thought is there's a perceptual difference, so we're going to grant that. Now, once you grant that there's a perceptual difference, there's a really obvious difference across these kinds of cases, right, between listening to a language you know. So like, I don't understand Latvian, I do understand English, so those languages sound different to me. But of course, English and Latvian just involve different kinds of sounds. Different languages differ acoustically. So you have to control for that, of course, right? That means fixing the language. So Jesse, in this remark, properly controls for the language. So that's a good thing. So we need to control for the language. But then you kind of get into a little bit of a trouble with these contrast arguments. And that's because controlling the language requires a contrast argument that spans people. So it's across subjects, as in Strawson's case, we're talking about Jacques and Jack, who are two different subjects, and he's claiming that there's a phenomenal difference between these two people. The other way to do it is to to talk about learning, okay? So to talk about the experience of a single subject across time, right? So what you do is you listen to the language, I listen to some Latvian, and then I go out and learn Latvian. And then the claim is there's a phenomenological difference there, and I can use this to ground my contrast argument. But of course, learning a language takes a lot of time. And I don't know about you, but my memory isn't so good for phenomenology. So epistemically, the argument turns out to be a lot weaker than cases where you have a sort of simultaneous, it's not like looking at a square of red and a square of green before you and claiming those are phenomenologically, there's a phenomenal difference there. So the argument involves either comparing the experiences of different subjects or comparing the experiences of a single subject across a bunch of time. So, maybe this will work out. I think it's plausible that it could. Maybe you've got a really fantastic memory for phenomenal features. Or maybe you're just super good about communicating about phenomenology with other people, and you can kind of reveal that there's this difference there. But I think it would be nice if we had a sort of more stable argument to appeal to. So I actually think there is a kind of argument that you can make, and it has to do with the phenomenon of sine wave speech. So how many people know about this or have heard it before? Sine wave speech? Oh, so just a couple. Okay, good. So this is really cool. Sine wave speech is fantastic. So sine wave speech involves a kind of sounds like a bunch of random blips and bleeps and blurps, right, when you first hear it. So here's a sample of some sine wave speech, which I hope works. Did you guys hear that? Okay. Yeah. I'll play it again. What'd that sound like? Somebody? Just random. Sounds like a bunch of flips and blurps. Okay, now, so listen to this.
She ironed her skirt.
Did everybody hear it? He said, she ironed her skirt.
She ironed her skirt.
Okay? Okay, now I want you to listen to the sine wave again. I want it to be nice and loud. How many people understood it the second time? Any phenomenological difference going on there between the two cases? I think that's a pretty robust, it's an intrapersonal, relatively short time span phenomenological difference. Okay, so take that. That doesn't show that listening to a language you understand differs from a language you don't understand yet. So it turns out, I don't have a sample of this, unfortunately, that doing the same kind of demonstration in a foreign language leads to a difference, right? There's a difference, but it's not nearly as dramatic as the difference for a language you know, right? So there's a phenomenal contrast. It's not a dramatic one, but there's a difference, and people report that pretty consistently. So take the difference between the differences in the case of a language you know and the case of a language you don't know, and that's the difference that accrues thanks to understanding or to knowing the language. Okay? So there's a little phenomenal contrast argument with a trick or two here and there that I think does get you to the claim that there's a phenomenal difference intrapersonally over a short time span. Okay, so that's the argument and a kind of tuned up version of an argument for the claim. So what then are the commitments? So remember, the claim is that you hear meanings or semantic properties, and that's the best explanation for this kind of phenomenal difference. Okay, this general type of phenomenal difference. Meaningfulness, that is, being auditorily, perceptually aware of some sounds as meaningful, or having the property of being meaningful, isn't going to suffice to explain that difference. It's not, because the difference between hearing some foreign language speech in a language you don't know can sound different from hearing those same sounds as non-speech. And hearing something to be meaningful, if that doesn't require hearing specific meanings, might be able to account for that difference. So what we need is specific meanings, and that's certainly the spirit of the claim as it's been made by its proponents. So let me see if I can find some nice examples of this sort of thing. Here's an example. McDowell is an example of somebody who holds a version of this claim. So he says it's the contents of the sentences rather than the mere words that you hear. You're capable of hearing or seeing in the words the meanings if you understand it. And Tim Bain says, seems plausible that the perceptual, he's talking about perceptual phenomenal differences here, that are brought about by learning a language involve both low-level and high-level semantic differences. And Susanna Siegel says, you know, when you learn to read, you become disposed to attend to the semantic properties. And she actually says it suggests that the taking in of those semantic properties can be merely sensory. So the spirit of the claim seems to be that you hear specific semantic properties. And that's the sort of thing that could explain the differences I'm talking about while also explaining, differences across particular utterances. So it's got to be specific semantic properties of utterances that are grasped, that are represented or perceived. This has a sort of, I think, really counterintuitive implication, which is that for any class of expressions in a language that you can understand or grasp as meaningful or contentful, so things like everything from words, like, you know, you can, when I say duck, presumably you grasp the content of that, to clauses maybe, or maybe indicative sentences or questions. For any such class, it looks like you can perceptually represent semantic differences even where there are no straightforward acoustical differences. So there's a kind of argument from homophones that you can run, which is that if you can hear the words duck and frog as meaning different things, then you should be able to hear homophonic utterances like pole and pole as meaning different things. Now, that's a little bit of a cheat, obviously. Maybe you need some context. But so the semantic perceptual theorists might say, add in the surrounding linguistic context. So I say, Mac visited the southern pole of the Earth last winter, versus Mac visited the poll to vote in the most recent presidential election. The claim has to be that there's a phenomenological difference in the semantic properties that are represented when you hear the utterance of the word poll across those two cases. It seems not entirely obvious to me, but that's got to be the claim. That's an I'm just pointing that out as an implication of the view. The same thing can be said for complete expressions as well. So think about structurally ambiguous sentences like, everyone loves someone. The thought is that when you hear everyone loves someone in each of the two possible readings, there is a perceptual difference with respect to the semantic properties that are being represented. And you know, you can run these kinds of, there's lots of fun examples of these cases. You know, visiting relatives. What is it? How does that one go? Visiting relatives can be boring. That's one of the good ones where. So these discussions are pretty familiar from the understanding language case, but it turns out that these differences have to be, according to the semantic perceptual account, reflected at the perceptual level. And the reason that they've got to be is that if you deny that, then I think it just defangs the entire account, the entire semantic perceptual account, because it means that the only semantic differences that you can perceptually represent are those that are marked by acoustical differences. Right? So any argument you could have in favor of the claim in terms of contrast arguments is going to drop away, because you can never control for the acoustical differences while varying the semantic differences. Right? So it just kind of takes the entire wind out of the account if you say that sort of thing. So it's got to be specific semantic differences represented perceptually even across homophonic expressions. Okay, just a commitment of the account. So now I want to talk about something that's really been driving me a little bit crazy over the last couple of years, and hopefully you all can sort me out on this. I want to talk about what is it that's represented perceptually when you're doing this thing. And I don't know of any, and if anybody knows of discussions in the literature of this, please let me know, because I haven't been able to track any down. So think about what it is that you grasp when you understand an expression. So take an utterance, call it you, and suppose that it means something. It means P. So you means P is true. So what do you grasp when you grasp the meaning of the utterance you? Actually, I'm interested in people's thoughts about this. Does anybody want to just answer this question? What do you grasp? The intention of the speaker. That's a little trickier. I guess I was thinking you grasp P. That's the requirement. That's the brute level requirement on understanding the language. So you grasp P. So if I say, you know, snow is green, you grasp, you know, when you understand that thing, you represent or you entertain or you kind of token a state with the content that snow is green. So, but that doesn't have to be committal. You don't have to believe it. You just have to entertain it, right? You just have to perceptually represent it in this, you have to represent it in this non-committal way. And that's all really that seems to be required. At least that's what's going on normally, is that you you entertain P appropriately in response to the utterance you. That's what it is to kind of grasp the meaning of that. Okay, so if you perceptually represent what you grasp when you understand the meaning of something, right, then, well, you perceptually entertain or perceptually represent P, right? That's the meaning, is P. So you perceptually represent that snow is green, right? So you auditorily, perceptually represent that snow is green. So you hear that snow is green. Now, I'm not inclined to accept that that's the content of your auditory experience, the same proposition that you entertain when you grasp that P. Professor Millikan accepts this claim, but Professor Millikan has a theory that entails it. So I don't think any of the rest of us, unless we've got a theory that entails it, unless we accept that same theory, are entitled to believe that that's the thing that's perceptually represented. And I certainly don't think somebody like Susanna Siegel wants to accept that snow is green as the content of what's perceptually the content that's perceptually represented. Certainly not the accuracy condition for your perceptual state when I say it. Okay, so then, now I don't know, this argument is a kind of sophism, right? And it's meant to be a sort of sophism. It's a sophism that's meant to point out that there's a kind of ambiguity in what we talk about when we talk about grasping meanings, right? There's the propositions themselves that are expressed, and then there's these other properties, these meaning properties, right? That the thing means P, that we talk about when we talk about understanding meanings. So it's got to be, I think, the latter sort of property that's perceptually represented. So it's got to be perceptually represented that means P is the property you hear the utterance to have. It's this semantic property of meaning P or has the content that P or something like that. It's not P, of course. But I think the deeper point of the whole discussion is that I think that that means there's a kind of funky mismatch going on between the cognitive contents that you grasp or understand when you understand a language and the perceptual features that are supposed to be represented. Why? Because normally it's not a requirement that you think that utterance meant P when I'm sitting here speaking. So it looks like there's a funny mismatch between the contents of perceptual experience and the contents of cognition just in normal, attentive listening to some spoken language. Now somebody might, well, actually, let me just talk about it. I mean, one way to appreciate this is think about kids, right? Just a little kid who understands, pretty good at understanding the language. So the kid knows what snow is green means. The kid has the thought snow is green. The kid can't, but suppose the kid doesn't have the concept of linguistic meaning or the concept of semantic content. Well, the kid can't have the thought or the belief that utterance means that snow is green. The kid just thinks snow is green. And yet the kid who understands the language is attributing those semantic properties perceptually to the utterance. And I sort of think versions of this argument can be run with normal adults too. Dean Pettit actually has attacked the claim that you have knowledge of these semantic properties, in part by arguing that it's not a requirement on understanding that you have these semantic beliefs that I'm talking about. And he's got some nice examples in a 2002 paper in Mind, where he talks about beliefs about these semantic properties are not required. There's a kind of reply to this, though. One way to put it is that, look, normal, healthy, reasonably conceptually sophisticated adults are going to form these beliefs anyway. So if I ask you, Rob, do you believe that snow is green means that snow is green? It would be surprising for you to deny that, right? So I can elicit that from you. And I think this gets at the kind of core of Stephen's reply to Dean Pettit in this early paper, where he says, look, it's normally the case that we can attribute these beliefs to people. They're just tacit beliefs. They may not be explicit or recurrent beliefs. They're sort of tacit beliefs grounded in sort of standing beliefs about the semantic properties of language. Okay, so suppose they're just tacit. Well, then we've still got a difference between the perceptually represented features and the explicit or recurrent contents of cognition, when you're attentively listening and so on. So this at least makes it sort of either some kind of funny or non-standard case of cognitive penetration, if that's how you want to explain the case. Your merely tacit, non-occurrent contents of the things that are affecting or interpenetrating perceptual experience. There's another sort of related argument that you could talk about here, which is that, in fact, having the beliefs, the tacit beliefs about the semantic properties depends upon those other occurrent beliefs you have, which involve the content that P, not semantic properties like means that P. That's another way that you can run this sort of thing. Somebody might respond to this and say, well, look, this is maybe there's a match in something like the tacit contents of perception. Right? So there's not this sort of mismatch in the occurrent contents. Well, it's not totally obvious what we mean by tacit perception. I think there's a few things you might mean. Maybe you mean it's kind of encoded as a kind of perceptual rule, something like the way that a Marian theory might have tacit representations of edges and lines. But then that's not the kind of thing that could affect conscious perceptual experience. The other way you might go is to say that it's, the analog of tacit perception is perception outside attention. But that doesn't seem to be the right way to go, because there's plenty of cases where these are attentive and focal. In fact, the quote from Siegel just makes that totally explicit. These are focal, attentive cases in which you don't have to have the explicit online belief that the thing has the semantic properties you're talking about. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about before sort of moving past this part of the discussion is this raises the question, so suppose you accept all of this stuff and you frame your semantic perceptual account in the right way. It raises the question about what's involved in representing these semantic properties, like means P, perceptually, right? So presumably that's going to trade on what's required to perceptually represent these properties generally. Now, arguably, representing, just period, the property of meaning that P requires representing that P. So arguably you can't represent that such and such means P without representing P. But of course we've sort of already gone through the reasons to think you don't auditorily represent P. So it's got to be then, if this is right, that the perceptual awareness of these semantic properties is in some sense primitive, right? It's not something that piggybacks on the perceptual representation of the contents themselves. So I don't know, maybe it's non-conceptual, or it's just a sort of basic form, or we owe some other account. So I think the lesson of this is that the semantic perceptual account owes a story about what's involved in perceptually representing properties like means P. Again, perceptually. And that makes the case of semantic properties a little bit different from the case of natural kind properties, where it's just the same content that's involved in cognition that's being represented. Okay, so that's enough of that point. I guess I'll just briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on it. I've argued in a paper that came out a couple of years ago that there's an alternative account that captures everything we want to capture about the perceptual differences that doesn't require appealing to semantic properties. And this sort of account depends on awareness of, perceptual awareness of language-specific but still non-semantic features. So I think that there is a perceptual difference when you hear a language that you know in contrast to a language you don't know, but we don't need semantic property awareness in order to explain it. So I think features that are language specific, like phonological features and other structural features like morphological features, can be the sorts of things that are among the contents of perceptual experience. These are the sorts of properties that differ across languages, though. Different languages make use of a different stock of these phonological properties. And perceivers actually have to do quite a bit of learning and need quite a bit of experience with the language and, quite a bit of confronting the language in order to be capable of perceiving these features. So there's an important respect in which learning a language involves learning to hear the sounds of your language. By that I mean it involves learning to hear the semantically significant sound types in the language. So learning which acoustical differences are relevant as potential markers of semantic differences and learning which ones are not. And I think that there's a kind of, and I think this is just pretty well established, that there's a kind of perceptual learning that goes on in these cases that changes the phenomenology of perceptual experience, but which doesn't need to be explained in terms of semantic properties. So again, I think there's quite a bit of evidence for this, that these things differ across languages, they differ across speakers of different languages, and that this can explain all of the difference that we need to explain. There's also lots of interesting, and I've got a bunch of slides very deep in this talk about various kinds of deficits that provide evidence of this, the relevance of these kinds of features. But I guess I'll just stop there and leave it at that.
You're not using the projector, just
No. Well, first of all, is the sound okay? All right. My talk is about linguistic intuitions and penetrability. But I'm concerned here not just with whether linguistic intuitions involve the sort of top-down cognitive penetration that Pillerson is talking about, but also whether they involve the bottom-up penetration of the bottom-up penetration of the central processor by linguistic competence, by the language faculty. And the way I'm going to be using the term, we have penetration when one area of the mind provides information to another. And we might, perhaps, some people do, call the sort of bottom-up penetration, you might call it a matter of central processor access to the lower levels of the mind. In my book, 2006 book, Ignorance of Language, I had a chapter that argued for a pointedly un-Chomskyan view of linguistic intuitions. This has received a storm of criticism from philosophers of linguistics. Since many of my critics are devout followers of Chomsky, you won't be surprised to hear that some of these comments have been, how can I put this delicately, not very nice. If you want to track this debate, you can do so pretty easily by going to my website. So I guess if you have a taste for blood sports, you might like to try tracking the debate. It's actually a pity that Barry's not here, because you would have seen an instance of this blood sport if my friend Barry had been present. But we'll have to do without him. It would have certainly livened things up. My aim here is to briefly present my views about linguistic intuitions, the ones that have so upset many people, and relate them to the issue of penetrability. I draw on a paper called Linguistic Intuitions Are Not the Voice of Competence, which is about to appear in a volume edited by Matthew Haug called Philosophical Methodology. The intuitive linguistic judgments, intuitions, I'm now on to my first section, in which I'm going to discuss the received views of linguistic intuitions. Intuitive linguistic judgments, which I'm just going to call intuitions, serve in linguistics as the main evidence for grammars. And in philosophy, they serve as, apparently, the only source for evidence for semantic theories. The intuitions we're talking about are intuitions about, they're metalinguistic intuitions, and they're intuitions about acceptability, grammaticality, ambiguity, reference, truth conditions, entailments, and so on. So my question, the penetrability question, is, in what way, if any, are these intuitions the result of penetration? Well, let's look at linguistics first. The received Chomskyan answer to this is that the intuitions are the result of our state of linguistic competence penetrating the central processor. My somewhat playful name for this view is voice of competence. or for short, VOC. You'll see why in a second. Here's the way I explain the view. Linguistic competence, all on its own, provides information about the linguistic facts. So these judgments about those facts are not arrived at by the sort of empirical investigation that judgments about the world usually require. Rather, a speaker has a privileged access to facts about the language, facts captured by the intuitions simply in virtue of being competent. So competence not only plays the dominant role in linguistic usage, it also provides informational content to metalinguistic intuitions. Those intuitions are, indeed, noise aside, the voice of competence, and that's why they're reliable. VOC is clearly a case of competence penetrating the central processor. But what about the reverse? Central processor input to linguistic intuitions. Is the central processor input? Now, I take it that the received view is that there may be such penetration. There is a concern in linguistics, which Stephen was mentioning earlier on, that the intuitions of the linguists themselves may be influenced by their linguistic theories. And that would, of course, be an example of the penetration. Now, I think there's overwhelming evidence that VOC, voice of competence, is the view in linguistics, the received view in at least Chomskyan linguistics. But there are three noteworthy points. First, mostly the view is presupposed rather than stated. It's actually seldom articulated. Two, more interestingly, to my knowledge, it's never been stated in the sort of detail that could make it a real theory of the source of intuitions. Thirdly, again to my knowledge, until very recently, no argument has ever been given for it. The exception is Georges Ray, in a paper that's also in the Haug volume that I mentioned earlier. And I've argued in that volume, in my paper, that Ray is wrong about this. That is, wrong about his defense of VOC. What about philosophy? Do philosophers think that their linguistic intuitions reflect a similar sort of bottom-up penetrability? Well, it's hard to say. Now, just ask this question. Why do philosophers suppose that intuitions are good evidence for a semantic theory? What could be their source, according to the philosophers, that would make them reliable? Michael McKinsey claims that philosophers think that these intuitions are a priori. And I think that Michael's got it pretty right here. So suppose that's true, where does that leave us on penetrability? Well, I think scientific ideas like penetrability hardly seem to fit with the whole a priori view of what's going on in philosophy, so I don't know that we've got a clear answer to that. But anyway, I think appeals to the a priori are always dubious, and it seems to me they're particularly so about semantic properties. So I'm just going to set that idea aside. Another idea has been proposed, first by Steve Stitch. Steve Stitch thinks that philosophers may, deep down, have a more respectable justification for their practice than appeal to the a priori. His suggestion is that they might think implicitly they may be taking an idea from the linguist, the idea of voice of competence, VOC. Others have suggested this too, Williamson and also Hinticker. So philosophers on this view, philosophers may think that a speaker's underlying competence provides her not only with the syntactic intuitions that the linguists think they provide, but also with semantic ones, about reference, for example. I've argued that VOC is false, and I'll get to a brief summary of the argument in a minute. But first, and this I move now to my second section, I want to make a couple of crucial distinctions. And the first of these crucial distinctions is the distinction between usage and intuitions. A lot of the literature, it seems to me, about intuitions, the linguistic philosophy of linguistic intuition literature, seems to me to conflate these two ideas. It's trivial that competence, along with some other factors, is causally responsible for linguistic usage. I mean, that's what competence does, primarily, you'd think. But that's not what VOC is about. It's about competence not as a source of usage, but as a source of metalinguistic intuitions. So in rejecting VOC, I'm not resisting, there are a number of things therefore I'm not resisting, and here are some. I'm not resisting the familiar Fodorian claim that, quote, you can't help hearing an utterance of a sentence in a language you know as an utterance of a sentence. We've been hearing a bit about that earlier on. And I have no problem with the following claim of Georges Rey. Speech perception involves a highly modularized perception of linguistic features of the speech vehicles themselves. We hear the utterances of a language. We hear the utterances of a language we know in terms of morphemic constituency, syntactic structure, and logical form. And that's the sort of thing that Barry likes to say too. Well, I interpret these sorts of claims as follows. Let's take a sentence, and this is the sentence that Georges was using as his example. John seems to Bill to want to help himself. Now, the way I understand this claim of Georges is that in understanding that sentence, we hear it as having those linguistic features and not others, in that, as a result of all the processing in the language system, we come up with a representation that has those features and not others. For example, we come up with a representation that has a feature that takes himself to co-refer with John, not Bill. I don't find any problem with that. That seems indeed to me to be the case. What I do find very implausible is that in hearing this sentence in this way, the central processor thereby has the informational basis for the intuitive judgment that himself co-refers with John. We've been given no reason to believe that. Hearing an utterance in a certain way is one thing, judging that it has certain properties, another. And if I can make a little aside on what Casey was saying a second ago, I actually argued that stuff about that you mentioned, Dean Pettit. I argued it in my 1981 book, Designation. That the whole one of the troubles for all this is it seemed one of the troubles for the sort of common ways of thinking about this, it seems to require that people have concepts which they needn't have, like semantic concepts, concepts like mean or even refer. Little aside, some people, including Barry and Mark Texture in a recent article in Erkenntnis, and also Gareth Fitzgerald in the BJPS, some people think that there's what Texture and Smith call seemings, linguistic seemings, and that these linguistic seemings, which they want to identify with intuitions, are both in between the processes of language use and the metalinguistic intuition. There's something in between those. That's one feature of them, and the other is that they provide evidence for grammars. Well, I don't think there is any such linguistic seemings, and I've argued this in response to Mark Texture's paper in Erkenntnis. So let's move now to the second crucial distinction. This is the distinction between data and information. I'll make this distinction between data and information in briefly presenting my own view of linguistic intuitions, which Steve alluded to earlier on. My own view is that intuitive judgments about language, like intuitive judgments in general, quote, are empirical, theory-laden, central processor responses to phenomena, differing from many other such responses only in being fairly immediate and unreflective, based on little, if any, conscious reasoning. Although a speaker's competence in a language obviously gives her ready access to the data of the language, the data that the intuitions are about, it does not give her ready access to the truth about the data. The competence does not provide the informational content of the intuition. So in this respect, linguistic competence does not penetrate the central processor, on my view. And in this respect, my view is sharply different from VOC. And it's sharply different in another respect. It's modest, making do with cognitive states and processes that we were already committed to. So following Mark Texter, I now call this view the modest explanation, or ME. So we've got VOC, which is the received explanation, and then ME is the modest one. So, on my view, the intuitions are simply a central processor matter. Next section, a case against VOC. What's wrong with VOC? Why should we prefer ME? Before answering this, we need to distinguish two possible versions of VOC. There's what I call the standard version, which gets a deal of support from statements by Chomsky and most explicit of all probably an old paper by Graves and about 7 or 8 other people. On the standard version of the doctrine is based on the representational thesis that linguistic rules and principles are represented in the language faculty. So you've got the representation of the rules in the language faculty. Speakers are then, on this view, thought to derive their intuitive judgments from these representations by a causal and rational process, rather like deduction. Though there's, as I said, evidence for this view in the literature, there are a number of people, including, for example, Barry, who are scornful of the representational thesis. So it may well be that this is not the right way to understand VOC, and we should go for what I call the non-standard version. And the non-standard version is that the intuitions are provided somehow or other by embodied but unrepresented rules. So the rules are in there all right, but they're not represented. Now, I have a whole range of objections to this, but I haven't got a great deal of time, so I'm just going to give you the most important of them. The first, let's take the standard version. My first question about it is, how does this explanation really work? The intuition that a linguistic expression has certain properties is in the central processor. Quite obviously, it's a belief. How can representations of principles in a language faculty of the mind that is inaccessible to the central processor be brought to bear on a representation of that expression, the expression in question, in order to deduce the intuition in the central processor? That's never been explained. But my main objection to the standard version is its extreme immodesty. This immodesty lies in its commitment to the representational thesis. A major conclusion of my book, in fact, in a way, my book is a sort of long argument for this. My major conclusion is that there is no significant evidence that linguistic rules are represented in the minds of speakers. And given what else we know, it's implausible to suppose that they are. Turn to the non-standard version. The further objection to the non-standard version is simple and apparently overwhelming. We do not have any idea how embodied but unrepresented rules might provide linguistic intuitions. Not only do we lack the details, I just complained that we don't have the details for the standard version, but it's worse here. It's not only that we lack the details needed for a plausible explanation, but attention to other similar systems gives reason to suppose that the linguistic system does not provide these intuitions, and we could never have the details. Think of what the explanation would require. It would require a relatively direct path from the embodied rules of the language to beliefs about the data, beliefs about expressions of that language. And it has to be the relatively direct in that it has to be a path that does not go via central processor reflection on the data. What could that path be? Consider some other examples. It's very likely that rules that are embodied but not represented govern, here are some motor activities: swimming, bicycle riding, catching. Here are some cognitive activities: typing and thinking. It's very likely that all of those are governed by embodied but unrepresented rules. Yet there does not seem to be any direct path from these rules, whatever they may be, to relevant beliefs. Why suppose that there is such a path for linguistic beliefs? Why suppose that we can have privileged access to linguistic facts when we cannot to facts about these other activities? We do not have, I claim, the beginnings of a positive answer to these questions, and it seems unlikely that the future will bring answers. I should mention that since writing my book, I've become aware of a lot of developmental literature which seems to me to confirm that the VOC is false, because it seems to show that the gaining of linguistic competence is something that happens in early childhood, and the capacity to come to any metalinguistic judgments about the language occurs in middle childhood. But I'll spare you the evidence for this. So that's a brief summary of why I think VOC is false. What's the methodological significance? I'll just close with this. What's the methodological significance of all this? Well, start with linguistics. In linguistics, it's accepted, though the focus, as Steve was pointing out, though the focus is on the preeminent source of evidence seems to be intuitions, in linguistics it's quite clear that other evidence is sought and used. Evidence to be found in the corpus, in elicited production, reaction time studies, eye tracking, and electromagnetic brain potentials. So grammar construction is not solely reliant on native intuitions. I'm sorry, native speakers' intuitions for evidence. But the degree to which it should be so reliant clearly depends on whether VOC, or something like my modest explanation ME, is right. Thus, if VOC is right, and competence really does produce these intuitions, then of course intuition should be the preeminent source of evidence for grammars. Noise aside, they must be true. On the other hand, if VOC is not right, and hence presumably something like ME is right, then intuition should surely lose that preeminence. Other evidence should come to the fore. Indeed, the extent to which the folk are reliable about their language at all becomes an open question. At least that reliability needs to be thoroughly tested against other evidence. We should note too that this question of VOC versus ME affects what you should think about the issue of the intuitions of linguists themselves versus the intuitions of the folk. If VOC is right, then we seem to have very good reason to think we should prefer the intuitions of the folk, because after all, the linguists may be introducing a very unfortunate sort of noise, namely theoretical bias. But if ME is right, then there is no reason to prefer the folk over the linguist. In fact, we should really prefer the intuitions of the linguists because they're the more expert. What about the methodological implications of this issue for philosophy? Well, ME is a rival to the VOC view of semantic intuitions, just as it is to the VOC view of syntactic intuitions. And the significance of this rivalry for the philosophy of language is analogous to that for linguistics. In particular, if VOC is not right and something like ME is, then insofar as we use intuitions as evidence, we should prefer those of the more expert philosophers to those of the folk. But much more importantly, we should be looking for other evidence for semantic theories. And we should be using that other evidence to assess the reliability of intuitions. That is, if ME is right, we should not simply be relying on intuitions in philosophy. Of course, this raises an interesting question. What other evidence should we be seeking in philosophy? Well, as I've noted, philosophers, unlike linguists, do not acknowledge any other evidence. And I've argued that they're very wrong not to. There is, in fact, lots of other evidence, and philosophers should take ideas from linguists and trying to find it. In particular, philosophers should seek evidence in usage. They should seek direct evidence in linguistic reality itself, rather than simply relying on the indirect evidence of intuitions about that reality. In doing this, I think they should be guided by the linguists and look to the corpus and to the technique of elicited production. In sum, whether VOC is right, with linguistic competence penetrating the central processor, or rather, whether something like ME is right, with no such penetration, is of great methodological significance for the study of language by both linguists and philosophers. Thank you.
Is it working? Now it's working. We've got plenty of time for discussion. Actually, since we're a panel, I don't know what being a panel means, but it's supposed to be different. So, did anyone want to say anything to each other before? I have a question I could throw out, and we'll make it panel-like, and then we can open it up to. We have plenty of time for discussion after I think we'll get everyone in. All right, I'll throw mine out then. Why not? The chair's prerogative. So, I'll start actually a question for you, Casey, but Michael actually expressed his agreement, and indeed expressed his having had it first in 1980. So it's a question, I guess, for you also. But your kids' argument, kids don't have the concept of meaning. I guess two things. What if someone were to say that we shouldn't be so quick to assume that, Paul Bloom and others have work that shows that kids seem to be very sensitive to whether something's a representation from a very early age. So you show a kid a picture of something that looks artifact-like, they might not know no one might know what it is. A picture of something, it's a blicket, and then you tell them to go over there and grab the blicket, and over there is a picture of it's an exact copy of the one they saw, but also the item that's in this picture. They go grab the item and not the picture. So they realized that that this thing was a representation of a blicket. And there's other kinds of work like that. They might not have lexicalized the concept of representation, simply for meaning, but maybe one could argue that they have the concept available, and it can be part of the content of their perceptual representation, and similarly for meaning. And then the second part of this question is that, and if not the concept of representation or meaning, maybe at least one could make the argument that they have some more specific concepts associated with force. So maybe it's not so strange to say that a kid that you're willing to attribute understanding to might have, though not have lexicalized yet, the concept of telling versus the concept of asking. Kids, again, at a very early age are clearly able to distinguish these speech acts, and perhaps they have the concept of them, even if they don't have them lexicalized. Would that be a...
So, I guess three things to say about that. The first is, it strikes me that the concept of representation needn't be coming online in parallel to linguistic competence. Those things might be sort of divergent. We'd also need evidence that they're linked up in the right way. The point that there's also a difference between linguistic representation or semantic content and this pictorial content that I could lean on. So that's kind of the second thing. On the third, that's sort of an interesting idea. I haven't thought about that yet, so I'd need to spend more time.
Right, then I'll throw a question at you, Michael, if that's okay, and then we'll open it up. Actually, I was curious to hear more about something that you mentioned in passing. Said you would argue about it. You had argued against it elsewhere, but since it's relevant to the conference, I thought maybe I'd ask you to expand upon it. So, you said you wanted to argue against the idea of these linguistic seemings. So the linguistic seemings can be understood as a sort of perceptual representation that then causes the perceptually based judgment. Certainly there are linguists who, just like in vision science, exploit the fact of linguistic illusions in order to understand linguistic processing. Colin Phillips and his students would be a good example. And they spend a lot of time worrying about different kinds of linguistic illusions, including grammatical illusions. I suppose the most famous one that people are already aware of are sentences like, more people have been to France than I have, which, stop and think about it. If you haven't heard, more people have been to France than I have. You understood what I said? Okay, so, it persists that, that you think that I've just said something, that you understand what it meant, but just think about it a little bit longer, you'll see that it's complete nonsense. It doesn't, whatever. So that might be, that's the kind of thing, however, that might get someone to think that there's such a thing as linguistic seeming that's distinct from a linguistic judgment. You don't believe that it means anything. You don't even believe that you might not even believe it's parsable, and yet it certainly seems to be, and that's persistent. So for the same reason that one might distinguish perceptual seeming from perceptual judgment given the mule liar, why not here too? And so forth and so on for a wide range of, there's fewer linguistic illusions, not as easy to find and exploit as there are the visual illusions, but they exist.
Yes, well, yeah, I've got to say I can't remember all the argument that I put together on linguistic seemings. I mean, it's in an article in Kentness. But let me try and, I'll just be, since I don't remember very well the details of this. Look, I don't for a moment deny that there can be, I don't obviously want to deny that there are linguistic experiences, right? What I'm denying is that that whatever there is, See, what we're trying to figure out is where the informational content of the judgment comes from, the intuitive judgment. And there's obviously all sorts of things going on in language usage, processing of all sorts of things. I mean, this is an extremely complicated process, as we all know. But now, and some of this, of course, we have some awareness of. But what's at issue is how anything that's going on there, any of those experiences, conscious or unconscious, what's at issue is how any of it could actually provide informational content to a judgment. That's what's at issue, and I, in this paper, argue that it doesn't seem we can make any sense of this. And I certainly don't think there's any evidence for it. But I really have forgotten all the details of the argument. Yeah.
Apologize for putting you on the spot about that. Since I don't remember exactly what I said in my response to Dean Pettit either, I understand.
It's quite intricate, yeah. Yeah.
All right, well, let me open it up, and we have plenty of time, so you can make your questions long this time.
Cool. So, Michael, it's a quick question for you. So, and it's also a question for Stephen. So, it would seem that your views about the nature of linguistic intuitions should predict that experts should have different intuitions, at least in many cases, from lay people, right?
The expert should have
better and consequently not the same intuitions as lay people, right?
that isn't straightforwardly a
result. No, it is not. Of course, it's not a clear implication,
right.
But that's a plausible consequence.
Yes.
So what do you make of the data that Stephen just mentioned at the end of his introduction, which seems to show that there are actually very few differences, if any, between linguists' intuitions and lay people's intuitions?
Right. Look, quite a lot of attention has been focused on this by Stephen in his paper with Culbertson, and of course in you and your friends in the in experimental semantics. Well, the main consequence of the view I'm urging here is that there's no reason to prefer the intuitions of the folk over the intuitions of the experts. In fact, there are reasons to prefer the intuitions of the experts. Now, I don't mean in all circumstances, and it isn't a consequence of this that the experts will always be more reliable than the folk. What is, I guess, a consequence is that the experts will have a greater range of reliable intuitions than will the folk. That's the consequence. Now, that's only this isn't, of course, what the thesis was. This is just a consequence of the doctrine. It's not something that I care about very much. It just happens to be a consequence. And as I've just stated it, you will see it's not actually terribly easy to falsify. Because it's quite compatible with finding that the folk and the linguists do equally well over a vast range of stuff. And I'm struck by the literature that Stephen's talking about. In fact, Stephen put me onto this literature, where it seems as if there is a great deal of correlation between the linguists and the folk over a vast range of material. I think that's great. I don't have any problem with it. I don't see it as falsifying my view, but as I said, that consequence of my view seems to me a little hard to falsify.
No, it's working? Okay. For Casey. This is a friendly suggestion for your first part of your paper, for more evidence, and then a question about the last part of your paper. I'll do them both at once. So the suggestion for more evidence is cross-linguistic or interlinguistic homonyms and bilingual speakers, or even monolingual speakers. They're hard to find, but they do exist. So I'm going to tell you in Czech that Da Vinci really existed. Okay, listen to this. Da Vinci fakt byl. Okay, that in Czech just means Da Vinci really existed. So there's a whole body of evidence, and as a bilingual speaker, I certainly hear them as different, and I can pretty much guarantee that you hear them quite differently from what I hear that sentence as. But about the last part of the paper, the interesting thing about that is I hear the semantic difference immediately. It takes a little work for me to get to the syntactic differences, like the middle word is a verb or an adverb in Czech and a verb in English. And it takes a lot of squinting, a lot of work to find the phonetic similarities. In fact, whenever I find one of these homonyms, like I find that the English word yeast is a homonym, an exact homonym for a Czech word, which means to eat, right? And it's always a huge surprise when I find one of these homonyms, and I don't hear them as homonyms normally, right? It's work to find it, whereas the semantic stuff is, phenomenologically feels perceptual, right? Feels immediate. I mean, I agree with the second part of your paper that I certainly don't perceive the proposition in some way, and so there's a question of exactly what's going on when I hear the semantic dissimilarities, right? But the phonetics are the last thing I get from phenomenally, right? The semantics first, syntax second, and phonetics last.
There's a couple of things to say in response. The first is that there are two things you could mean by when you say you hear meanings. One is just that by virtue of hearing the utterance, you come to grasp the meaning. So everything I was talking about wasn't talking about that. It was talking about the claim that there is auditory perception or just perceptual representation, where that's supposed to be interestingly different from cognition. So we have to kind of assume there's a principal distinction between those things, and there are different ways of getting at them. I think it's reasonable. Everything I said about the source of the perceptual difference is compatible with there being cognitive phenomenological differences. So I think when you say, it just really seems different when I hear it, immediately, I think that's entirely compatible with the first reading of hearing that I was talking about, where if we're going in for a strict difference, then we say it's cognitive. On the second point about the semantic differences, or the phonological differences are more difficult to get at, I'm inclined to think that these are we get at these through perceptual similarities and differences among the utterances that you hear. So certainly something that contains a t sound, if I give you the words ton and ute and utter, you can recognize that there's a t sound in each of those. So it's a kind of perceptible similarity across those cases that we want to explain. And there's a range of similarities and differences that I think are perceptual, that are revealed in work on categorical perception for certain kinds of stop consonants, for example, and that is best explained in terms of awareness of these phonological features. And that's compatible with requiring further expertise in order to name them conceptually, and in some cases, single them out and isolate them and mark them with concepts in a language.
This is mostly from Michael DeVitt. You had said that you didn't think there was evidence that rules are represented in the minds of speakers, the kind of evidence that the VOC would need. I'm sure this is something you've written about. I'm just curious. I imagine
I'm finding it awfully hard to hear. There is evidence that what was it?
You said there is no evidence for the VOC view that there's rules are represented in the minds of speakers. And yes. I would imagine that the Chomskyians would offer the following kind of evidence, that they would give a kind of inference to the best explanation about early competence and...
About what?
Early competence of speakers. For example, children of...
Yes, right.
immigrant parents who speak pidgin languages seem to create Creole languages very, very quickly. And so I'm just wondering what your alternate explanation of this kind of early competence would be if it's not the VOC.
Well, wait a minute. What's at issue here is a thesis which I call the representational thesis, which is part of the what I call the standard version of VOC. And so what we're talking about is the idea that competent speakers of the language have represented in their language faculty the rules and principles of the language. That's what we're talking about. And that's what I say there is no evidence for. Okay. Well, there are lots of considerations which have been, what people might think count towards this, some from linguistic language acquisition, which is what you're talking about, also from linguistic usage. And it's just a matter of looking at them, each one in turn, and seeing what's wrong with it. Now, as far as language acquisition is concerned, I guess I don't see any, I don't really even see how maybe it would help if you did. Look, you've got, if you're going to look to language acquisition for an argument here, you're presumably going to have the view that given, let's accept the idea that there's a good deal of innate syntax. So there's an innate sort of UG in some sense. Then presumably your view would be that what's innate are certain representations of syntactic rules, principles, and then as you learn the language with perhaps fixing the values of parameters and so on, as you learn the language, then the representation of principles gets enriched until you finally have a representation of the rules of the language. But now, here's another story which seems to me to be just as compatible with all the data, which is, well, let me pause for a second. It's been pointed out, particularly by Stadler, but by many others, that, look, whenever you have evidence that certain rules of some procedure are embodied in an organism or a machine, you have to face the fact that there are at least two quite distinct ways they could be embodied. They could be embodied by being represented and then applied, as they are, for example, in a modern computer, or also they could be embodied by simply being embodied, as it were, hardwired in there without being represented, as, for example, they are in an old-fashioned mechanical adding machine. In an old-fashioned mechanical adding machine, you have the some rules of arithmetic are actually built into the damn thing, and it adds up, but of course it doesn't represent the rules. And the problem is that wherever you've got one machine that operates by representing a rule and applying it, you can come up with another machine which carries out, which embodies the same rule without representing it. So there's always an open question wherever you are confident that a rule is embodied in an object, whether it is embodied as a representation or not. And the behavioral evidence for this is often makes it very hard. It's very hard to get evidence for the representation. So what I'm doing in response to you is really that sort of thing. I'm saying, well, look, sure, that's one picture of what happens in language acquisition. Another picture is that what's innate in you are simply innate syntactic dispositions or whatever, innate syntactic. And that what then happens with learning, as you acquire the language, is that these innate dispositions are gradually modified so that you end up with the embodied rules of the language. I don't see any evidence favoring the much less modest view of representation. But gee, it's a long argument, and you get the same sort of argument. Of course, we can run through the same sorts of arguments to do with language processing. I mean, there was a time, if you go back to the 80s, 70s and 80s, where people did generally talk as if the rules of the language were represented in the mind. And some people still do in psycholinguistics, but it doesn't seem to me that anything that's going on in psycholinguistics, or hardly anything, really requires that hypothesis. The much more modest idea that actually what's going on is simply a lot of embodied rules will do the job. But I agree with you. It's an empirical issue which you just got to look at all the evidence. And it took, my whole book is a long discussion of the evidence for this, yeah.
Other questions? Good, I was worried I was discriminating against the rest of them.
So this is probably for Casey, but it's a rather general thing that I've been kind of pondering why it is that the discussions about conceptual penetration are kind of puzzling me. And I think they're puzzling me because it's not clear to me whether we should think that short-term effects are special in some way. So, your sine wave speech demo was really nice in one respect. It kind of showed us this quick, short-term penetration of experience by a piece of knowledge, I would say. We've changed our knowledge state by hearing the word. But that gives a sort of general take on this, where, there's kind of knowledge requirements that until they're in place render a certain kind of experience, even basic experience, impossible. I think that's what we saw in Kathleen Aiken's talk this morning, the idea that, hey, surprisingly, the knowledge requirements on red are harsher than the knowledge requirements on dog, something like that. Dog or cat, or, So that's a surprise. Knowledge requirements on red are harsher than those on dog. That seems to me now like, okay, that's an interesting case where, experience, even in the most basic phenomenological way, wouldn't be the way it is without these knowledge structures in place. Why should I care especially about the short-term effects or the medium-term effects or the long-term effects? Why shouldn't I just go sort of permeation all the way and that's how things work? Does that make? Is there something special about short-term effects so that we should focus on them a bit and be asking questions like, if I throw a sentence at myself that expresses something I believe, how far down can that penetrate?
I think we'd like to explain them. I sort of like that idea. Yeah, sympathetic to that.
Another hand.
This is also for Casey. If I understood correctly, your perceptual learning proposal at the end was that we had purely perceptual associations between phonemes, grouping, structure, all linguistic associations, but I wanted to offer a slightly different perceptual learning proposal that, and see what you thought of it, and this wouldn't entail any representation of meaning in perceptual experience, but it might entail a kind of cognitive penetration. So, cognitive penetration. Yeah, so it would work like this. So you would have an auditory perceptual experience just of the acoustic properties of the word, and then you grasp the meaning through cognition, and then you have associations between the conceptual meaning and other perceptual things. So it might trigger some mental imagery or something like that, and those are going to be dependent upon the language that someone learns. So, yeah. So like, if I know English, I'm going to associate friendly with sunshine and bunnies and puppies and rainbows. But if I don't know English, none of those associations are going to be triggered, and presumably there are going to be perceptual aspects to those concepts. So, what do you think of that story as a possible explanation of the phenomenal contrast?
I think it's an alternative.
I think it's incomplete, because I think there is good evidence for perceptual differences, kind of tuning of the perceptual system. Rob Goldstone's talk was music to my ears. I think there's there's good evidence for tuning of the perceptual system in these kinds of cases to language-specific categories of sound. So again, I think, was it Rob that someone mentioned in a talk yesterday the Japanese doesn't distinguish l and r as distinct phonemes. So it treats them as allophonic. And Japanese subjects who don't speak English have a very difficult time even hearing, that is, detecting auditorily the difference between those things, whereas native English speakers have no problem. This is the kind of thing that can be tuned up actually in individuals who learn language later, but it's actually quite difficult for late in life language learners. So it's actually subject to these kind of critical developmental period influences that we see in other perceptual learning effects. So I think there are perceptual differences that result in phenomenological differences across speakers and across individuals over time, which are the result of learning a language. It requires experience with and competence in the language. So the alternative story is incomplete. I mean, it may be, I could add that scaffolding onto my account if I feel like it's needed, but I feel like you need that kind of core difference. And this is not, I'm not the first person to make this. I should just be really clear. I'm not the first person to make this kind of argument. I have, I think, in some ways, some more developed arguments for the view, but the view has been proposed, and this kind of view has been proposed and endorsed by a number of people. Jesse, for example, holds basically this style of view. I'd be curious about some of the differences. Michael Tai talks about this kind of view. So again, I'm not the first one. I think I've taken a little more time and energy to spell out the details, but I think the framework of this story is pretty established.
This is a question for Michael. So suppose we grant that how we get access to linguistic judgments is not transparent, right? It seems clear that it's not transparent how we make those judgments. Still, I'm worried about your view for the consequences of your view for linguistic methodology. So what you suggest is, rather than consulting intuitions about grammaticality, we should look at usage. So we should look at the corpus and that sort of thing. And that's fine, and some people do and should. However, one of the most important sources of evidence in linguistics has been negative data, which you cannot find in a corpus. Judgments of sentences that are not grammatical, and being not grammatical, they don't occur. Island violations and things like that. So these have been massively important for developing current syntactic theory. So I'm just wondering if you would be so satisfied, for example, if you could find some kind of, like, for example, you talked about elicited production studies. If you could find a sort of correlate in elicited production that would sort of track the grammaticality judgments that linguists are making. So, for example, you give them, a stream of normal kind of sentences, and then you throw an island-violating sentence in there, and you watch them fall apart. Would that sort of satisfy you? Would it help to vindicate our use of naive judgments?
Yeah, look, I don't have any. I agree very much with what you say. First of all, let me add. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be using intuitions. I'm arguing primarily about their source, and if I'm right, I think there should be perhaps a bit of a change in emphasis in linguistics, but a massive change in philosophy. Obviously, negative evidence, as you're pointing out, is a is a difficult thing to find evidence for. Yes, I would have thought you could get evidence in elicited production for this. I'm really not much good at this experimental stuff, as I've discovered recently. But of course, so that's somewhere where intuitions can be helpful. I don't have any, look, I really just basically agree with you. Yeah. I'm not arguing against using intuitions. Yeah.
We have time for just 2 more questions, and there were a couple other hands, but Jurgen says we have to stop. So Rob and then Ruth, but do what you can to keep them shortish.
Okay, this is a question for Casey, which is a follow-up to your question and Andy's question, perhaps, in a way. And so I really like the story in general. And the possibility that you raise is that rather than people who speak different languages actually experiencing different semantics, they're really experiencing differences of the regularities of language. Right? But it occurs to me that some of these regularities of language are not just like these phonemes, but one of the biggest learning kind of things that you get is unitization. You know, combining together pieces into larger and larger units. And one of the ones that's studied a lot in psycholinguistics is word unitization in particular, which then bumps up very closely to semantics again. So we're not just teasing apart the pieces of the words, but joining them together to create these strong units?
I think this is an instance of kind of general worry I have about this story. So I'm appealing to these language-specific, but I'm calling them non-semantic features. And by that I mean they're not meanings. That's what I mean by non-semantic. There's this other sense in which they are semantic features. Even phonemes are, right? They're the minimal perceptible differences which can mark a semantic difference in a language. That's the characterization of these things. And that's the kinds of sound differences. What you're cueing on to perceptually when you're learning a language is the kinds of sound differences that can mark meaning differences. So, well, that sounds like a semantic property. So there's a sense in which they are semantic properties. They're kind of semantically constrained. I don't have a developed account of some sort of principled inference between perception, what's perceptual and what's cognitive. The idea that I'm pretty, I don't know, I'm in a state of thinking I accept it now, is that, look, there aren't any phenomenologically evident markers of what makes something cognitive or perceptual. And some kind of hierarchy there we get from the low level to the high level. We do have a lot of empirical ways of operationalizing that difference. So in psychophysics, I mean, most of the task in a lot of these discussions is to show that something meets the perceptual criteria. So I sort of think that's a pretty good way of thinking about it. So maybe we should characterize these states or these processes in terms of the way they're operationalized in the empirical science, and then it just turns out that if there's a certain phenomenal feature associated with that state, then it's a perceptual phenomenal feature. So we type the states first, and then we attribute the properties to them, and that's the way we say what's perceptual and what's cognitive. So anyway, this story is compatible with a kind of hierarchy, with no strict boundary or distinction there. I'm actually open. The other part of the story that differentiates, I'm open, at least in principle, to the idea that there's cognitive phenomenology for the kinds of reasons I just mentioned. So I'm not sort of limiting myself to that sort of pure kind of conservative explanation.
Just to underscore one thing you said, which is that something might be a semantic feature and it might have an effect lower down, but it doesn't follow, unless one gets clear on what's meant, that it's cognitive penetration, because it might not have anything to do with anything you believe. So you think of the semantic features that explain alternations, for example, in lexical semantics, and people have beliefs about those things. But then there's this question of what do we mean by cognition? Yeah. Okay, we'll reserve the last question for Professor Millikan.
Thank you. There's an awful lot of evidence nowadays that phonology has nothing to do with acoustics, right? That it's actually, what you're actually hearing when you hear what you think is the same phoneme again, is the same vocal gesture. Now, normally you'd think you could only see vocal gestures, but apparently what we do is to hear gestures. All right, so it's not obvious then to the senses what it is they are sensing. It's not obvious to your ear that what you are sensing is a similarity in vocal gesture rather than a similarity in acoustics, all right? Now, let me just give that as an analog. My suggestion was that when you hear a language, and the language is talking about something, that it is a way of perceiving the very thing being talked about, as through television, as through et cetera. All right, again, of course, you'd say, but when a person says dog, dogs don't sound like that, right? But supposing I say dogs do sound like that through language, and then I make the distinction between simply hearing the foreign language and understanding it as being like the difference between seeing an object and recognizing what it is, seeing you and recognizing that you are Casey, and make it that distinction. Now, is that a distinction in phenomenology between my seeing you and seeing Casey? Because if so, then the phenomenology, I think, is right in the... Then I think the phenomenology is right in the... as soon as you understand the language, it's exactly like suddenly I recognize that it's Casey that I'm seeing.
So I think at the heart of the question really is, am I assuming that we can make some kind of principled way of distinguishing more direct and more indirect forms of perception or perceptual awareness, which is a point you make in that chapter of the book and earlier. Is that the sort of force of the idea there? And is that something which is phenomenologically evident?
Well, I myself don't believe it.
Yeah, no, I know, yeah.
I don't think there is such a thing as phenomenology, but I'm just in your own position. When I suddenly see that it is a dog, this is perception.
Yeah, I'm not arguing about that question, though. No, it's not the question at issue here. I was saying this case is different from that question.
No, I'm saying it is the same. If what is happening when you understand the language is that you are hearing the world, and you suddenly recognize what you're hearing, it's like recognizing what you're seeing. So the difference between hearing the language and not understanding it, and hearing the language and understanding but understanding, it's just like seeing the thing and not knowing what it is, and seeing it and suddenly realizing that it's alive.
Yeah, so I'm going to resist that. And the point you mentioned earlier about gestures, and it looks like that these categories converge on gestural categories. I mean, that's in some ways that's one of my main reasons for being interested in the speech perception cases, because it's a multimodal perceptual phenomenon. And I think auditorily, you are hearing something which in fact has visible features. Now, I don't think that hearing something requires being aware of all of its features so that you can become perceptually aware of certain of its features. You can become aware of the thing, right, in being aware of certain of its features, but that doesn't require being perceptually aware of all of the thing's features. It's sort of a generalization of the parthood idea.
Here are not same differences in the acoustics. They are same differences as what is happening to gestures.
Yeah, and I think those are among the things you hear. Right, so audible things have audible properties like pitch and timbre and the rest of it. They also have features like being distally located, being generated by material things that interact in the world, And so these are, I think it's artificial to limit the objects of auditory awareness in these kinds of cases, or multimodal perceptual awareness, to just the kind of raw acoustical. Yeah, and I'm accepting it. Yeah, I mean, I've got a longer, I'm being told by Stephen to...
I'm being told by Jurgis that we have to wrap up. We've gone over. Before we, I want to thank our panelists, but let me say, after clapping, Jurgis has some announcements. But first, let's thank Michael and Casey and all the questioners.
Hi, everybody. I have three brief announcements. First of all, a couple of contributed speakers have not paid a conference fee. Please be so kind and come to Christine and do it as soon as possible. The second announcement, those of you who need a certificate of attendance, you can do it. You can let Christine know, and she will give you a certificate. And finally, we will have to start relatively soon. I mean, we're a bit late. I would say 5 minutes past 4 we should start, because there is night of museums today, and so the next session is 5 minutes past 4.